Good morning. So, as was mentioned, prosperity is a rather broad subject. And when we were first asked to participate, Martha and I had a bit of an LOL moment over email going, okay, sure, let's just talk about this big open thing. But of course, prosperity is one of the 5 Ps of the SDGs, along with people, planet, peace, and partnership. And it is defined there as all human beings able to enjoy a prosperous and fulfilling lives, and that economic, social, and technological progress occurs in harmony with nature. Still not quite that concise. So I was looking around a little bit more, and I went to the site for last year's event here at around roughly the same time, and found out that they actually spent 2 whole days on the subject. Building Prosperity with Economic, Social, and Natural Capital was the name of the event. There they defined prosperity as a successful, flourishing, and thriving condition, most often in economic terms, but increasingly in reference to health, happiness, and the environment. To achieve prosperity, governments, business, and civil society must look beyond today's economic uncertainty, and their actions need to be shaped and guided by a better understanding of the interrelatedness of our natural, economic, and societal systems. And of course, we've just launched the 2030 Agenda, the 17 new Sustainable Development Goals. And while it can be argued that all of the goals obviously are trying to deal with creating a more prosperous world, there are 5, particularly in reference to our discussions here over these 2 days, that really address issues related to prosperity. They include SDG 7, affordable and sustainable energy, SDG 8, decent work for all, 9, technology to benefit all, 10, to reduce inequality, 11, safe cities and communities, and 12 is responsible consumption by all. So we're starting to get a little bit narrower. And in an effort to really be able to use the time that we have and these 4 really amazing people who are working in 4 very important areas, decided to bring it down a little bit closer and have this focus on specifically a low-carbon emissions economy and what kind of an impact that has on the poor, on business, on financial markets, and civil society. So when we have exactly that, we have represented, I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves, but with Abigail Heron, we've got finance. Ashok Khosla is civil society. Josefina Patricia Magpale-Askeet is how it's pronounced, from policy, and Willem Quende representing business. So I'd like if each of you could just provide a brief introduction for yourselves, and then we'll get the conversation going.
Sure. So I'm the head of engagement at Aviva Investors, which means I spend my days meeting with the companies that we invest in and encouraging them, challenging them, having tricky conversations about environmental, social, and governance issues. So maybe for breakfast, I might be talking with one of the companies we invest in about, thinking about the last panel, gender and diversity. So one of the things we do at Aviva Investors is if a company is not taking gender and diversity in the boardroom seriously, we'll actually, at the annual general meeting, vote against the chairman of the nomination committee. And that's the nuclear option, but that's how seriously we take it. Maybe for lunch, I'll be talking with a company about biodiversity impacts or sustainable fisheries. And then the afternoon could be climate change or corporate governance, cybersecurity, antibiotic resistance. So a little bit of everything because we are long-term investors. We are also an insurance company, one of the largest insurance companies, at least in Europe. So it's quite easy for us to make the connection between flood risk or long-term impacts because we're long-term investors. And one of the things that one of the clients said to me recently was, how are you going to ensure a future that we actually want to retire into? And I thought that was really powerful. So I've taken that for my own.
Good morning. I am actually representing the government, and having been in the different agencies of government right now, though I am with energy, I have seen how really the most important, perhaps, challenge in making things work, as they say, is how to make sure that the private sector and government are working together hand in hand in order to be able to achieve the development goals that have been set. In the Philippine experience, government has taken the roadmap towards ensuring energy access for all by subsidizing the electrification in our islands. And it's quite a challenge having 7,107 islands in the Philippines. So we have isolated islands that have actually been powered by diesel or bunker fuel generating plants. But we have seen that because laws have been passed, we are now moving towards developing renewable energy in these areas. And we have identified actually how the private sector can participate in being able to achieve the goal of doing a mix. It's quite difficult to just have one source of energy in an island. And for a particular island that actually has a very small demand, it is quite a challenge. So I believe that really working with the private sector is a key and critical component in ensuring inclusive growth and, of course, making sure that a shared prosperity is achieved in all communities.
Thank you. I suppose I'm technically a civil society person, but a large part of what I do is a business. I'm as much a business person as an NGO, because what I do is work with an NGO, with a social enterprise called Development Alternatives, which was set up, well, tomorrow, 33 years ago. It's one of the largest social enterprises. It tries to do in a business-like way, in a commercially viable way, what NGOs and governments try to do in other ways. So we don't believe in subsidies, we don't believe in charity, we believe in making a good living, if you like, doing well by doing good. We also do it the other way around. We do quite a lot of good by doing well, because when we generate profits, we can put them into a reasonable kind of use, like more innovation, more multiplication. And I think a large part of my experience that I'd like to share with you comes from the fact that partnerships sometimes are extremely important. No, not sometimes, always. But there's one special kind of a partnership, which is integration, which is essentially doing more than one kind of sector combined, because you get synergies that you can't even get through normal partnerships. I've been working for my sins or my misspent youth in a variety of not-for-profit organizations. I was president of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, president of the Club of Rome, which really, in a sense, started the whole environmental movement in 1972. And currently, I'm chairperson of the International Resource Panel, which is essentially the equivalent of IPCC, but for natural resources. So I've got very deep concerns about how you use the bounties, the wonderful legacy of nature that the Creator has given us for the betterment of all mankind, humankind.
I'm William Kwende, chairman of Agri-Tech Group. It's a group we funded in Singapore about 10 years ago after I left the UN. I spent 15 years in the UN in the Philippines, mostly, but working on Southeast Asia. Agri-Tech Group is focused on rural community, mostly bringing technologies and integrating the rural farmers into the international value chain. Now, it might sound simple, but we work in an area where usually there is no electricity, there's no water, so we do have to build all the infrastructure. We work, of course, in partnership with the governments, the local governments mostly, as well as some of the international NGOs. Now, we also have a lot of programs which are focused to rural women. I work closely with the chairperson of the Rural Foundation, Foundation for Rural Women in Nigeria. And we work right now into providing access to gas. So we provide microfinance for the cylinders, as well as a skid station to provide a cheaper way of accessing the gas, refilling the gas. So they do not have to come and buy a whole cylinder. They can just, once they have acquired the cylinders through microfinance, just come and refill the cylinders. We also are developing a large programs with about 30,000 women, focused on bringing cosmetic ingredients to the market. So we're talking about shea butter and other oil that I guess most women here knows and that are today very popular with L'Occitane and all the other brands of cosmetics.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to sort of start in a very simple way, and that is, do you hear me now? Do you hear me now? Hear me now? No. Nope. It's like the AT&T commercial. Okay, well, I'll stand here for right now. Let's start, since all of your mics are working. The first question I wanted to know is, on its most simple level, what does immediately a low-carbon environment, a low-carbon economy look like, and how does that advance prosperity in the specific areas that you're working in? I know it's still very general, but if we can take it down, again, thinking in terms of issues related to prosperity, issues related to the base of the economic pyramid, if we can look at that, what are some of the immediate effects that we can have there? Let's see if we can start there. Anybody want to go first?
Maybe I can. In the Philippine experience, actually, we've actually submitted a commitment of lowering our carbon emissions by 70% down to 2030, and this is what has been submitted as an intended nationally determined contribution. But for a country that actually contributes less than 10%, less than 1% of the carbon emissions, it's quite a challenge considering that we have several islands, micro islands, 7,100 islands, where by themselves, they probably don't care. It doesn't mean much if you look at them individually. But certainly, cumulatively, it does. And on a larger scale, even on a larger scale, putting all the countries together, it does make a significance. But we are challenged likewise with developing country needs, especially on energy, where much of our available resources are more or less geared towards the carbon emission contributors. While we do have a national renewable energy plan, we're still very much challenged in terms of reliability and efficiency to be able to achieve our targets, and most importantly, cost. Subsidizing, unfortunately, cannot be done whole scale or large scale. I agree that there has to be integration and ownership, because otherwise the responsibility and accountability does not set in. So what we've done is to encourage private sector participation in these small islands, where we have to introduce the community their own share of the responsibility. So giving back to the community a sense of accountability to make sure that it's sustainable. Because if you just give it to them, like we can subsidize and put in solar home panels for communities and have a whole small island actually powered up that way. But we have seen also how that particular dole out, it just falls off because they don't take care of it. There is no maintenance and technical expertise even that remains to be able to sustain that kind of a system. So we have moved it a step higher to give it to the electric utilities. And then there is a tariff that they will have to be paid so that there is a contribution from the recipient. It's still very much of a challenge though, because cost-wise, there is still subsidy from not from national government, though, in terms of the per kilowatt hour cost, but from the universe of consumers. So we have in our electricity bill what you call a universal charge for missionary electrification. So part of the cost that powers up these islands is actually attached to my own consumption. And so there lies the challenge. How do you balance the need for energy, reliable and efficient energy, with the need also to fulfill our commitments to a low-carbon economy framework, and to make sure that it's sustainable enough to actually be understood and also to be worked on by the communities.
Assuming you've asked us about what a low-carbon future looks like rather than prosperity as a whole, which we'll come to maybe later. You know, the biggest user of energy, and today fossil fuel energy, is actually housing and construction. And it's 23% of the total. And my organization spent a lot of the last 30-odd years developing low-carbon housing solutions. So that's one big area. You can have a huge impact. And if you can make them affordable, as we've tried to do, then you really got a double whammy that is very useful. The second set of issues at the rural area end in a developing country is fixing carbon in nature, basically in soils and in forests and in biomass generally. And a lot of our work has essentially addressed that. How do you bring back the soils, the health of the soils, to such an extent that large amounts of carbon get fixed, forests and everything else that includes crops. So a very large part of the effort has to be on sequestration. And the idea of sequestration by pumping it into the ground is so crazy that we don't even think about that. But above the ground, growing plants, fixing nitrogen in the sort of life of the soil is a very good way. And the third major area of use of energy is really related to prosperity, as we'll come, which is for cooking and lighting. Yeah. And there we've got major league innovations. William talked about his gas stoves. And we don't, in my country, there are 140 million households that are below the poverty line, and they're never going to get gas, because if they get gas, we'll have used up the entire gas supply of the planet. So they're going to have to live with other kinds of cooking fuel, and we've been developing a variety of cooking solutions, including stoves and fuel types. And then the third is lighting, which is critically important for development. And there you really need the major new innovations like LEDs and storage, very advanced but very simple, cheap storage, and generation through renewables, through solar and wind and microhydro. So these are sort of a combination by which we have had a huge impact on low carbon. But my favorite one, which nobody wants to hear about, and certainly no one wants to do anything concrete about, is fertility, human fertility. If you bring into the life of a woman either some education or a job, the number of children she's going to have is 1/6 to 1/10 as many as she would otherwise. Now that has an impact, because we're talking about 2050. We're always talking about how much carbon emission we will have reduced by 2030, 2050. By 2050, we could easily have 1 billion fewer people living on this planet if every woman had a decent life. If she had a little extra education that delays her marriage by a year or two, and if she had a job I have a factory, an all-women factory making recycled paper in central India, and the fertility of the women there after 20-odd years has gone down by 1/12, to 1/12, compared with the control group. So, I mean, it's very dramatic. There were only 2 births in 20 years in that factory. And you know, in the villages around, there were 25 with similar number of women. So it's the ultimate low-carbon future lies in making the lives of women better, frankly.
If you don't mind, I want to pick up from that because we've got this wonderful gadget, and people are sending questions from all over. And one of the first ones, one of the ones that's right now getting the most votes, but picks up on gender, is safety is an important aspect of gender equality in developing communities, and what can be done to improve this. So I wanted to throw that out. Dr. Crosley, you've mentioned, in terms of women's fertility, women's empowerment, that is a big effort. But if any of you want to take on a little further discussion on this and ensuring safety for women in their communities, in their ability to advance, and their ability to build their prosperity. Anybody want to take that on? Please.
I think I'll take that question, following what Ashok has been saying. When you provide alternative sources of energy, such as either stove, improved cooking stove, or you provide gas, one of the things that you're also providing is security. I mean, these few hours that they will be spending going to the market to buy wood or going into the forest to buy wood, you're providing security. That's one thing. The second thing is that in terms of their health, which is also part of the security, a lot of the cooking methods that are being used, the traditional cooking stove with woods, it's extremely toxic. Right? And by, again, providing this enhanced cooking method, you are enhancing their safety. Ashok talked about education. We discussed and we're cooperating on his literacy and numeracy programs for women. Education is also one of the best way of providing safety. Because when a woman has too many children, she's putting herself at risk. She might not know that. And there's so many other issues that you can actually deal with when you're providing education, which I think we all do in the communities where we're working. But the benefits is also for the companies. I mean, of course, we are social enterprises, but having our workers in good condition, our partners in healthy, it's also very important for the success of the social enterprise and achieving prosperity in a certain way. You can't achieve prosperity if you don't have your partners in good health.
May I just add to that?
Sure.
Education keeps coming up and improving people's lives keeps coming up. But in this particular case, in the case of safety for women, both in urban and rural areas, probably education of the male child is also very important. So we've got to keep that in mind. It's traditional systems of thinking, traditional cultures don't bring up male children to think of women as being, human beings. And that's, I think, really a major issue that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, very true, very true. Going back, though, then, all of this takes money, fundamentally. So I'm going to throw the question to you, Abigail. This, again, is a question coming from the audience, and now they're all up there. As an investor, do you undertake sustainability valuation? And if yes, can you elaborate a little bit more? How are you looking at investing in these issues?
Sure, great question. So what we do is we integrate, which is one of the key words that we're picking up on the panel, but we integrate environmental, social and governance considerations into our valuation. One of the things that we do to encourage our fund managers and analysts to put this at the very centre of their portfolio construction is the RIO network, which stands for Responsible Investment Officers. And if you think of those as ambassadors throughout Aviva and throughout Aviva Investors, and people who take sustainability and put it inside their job, be they in marketing, they might be fund managers, every facet that we have, we've got 50 of those. So I've got a team of 8, but really we've got a team of 58 people that are finding different ways to put sustainability at the centre of the companies that we're exposed to. And I think it's really important as well to work with the companies that you invest in. You're in a very privileged position. It's fantastic the time and the access that you get to the companies you invest in. So I think it's really important to make the case to them why you want to be involved with them for a long time, why you see sustainability as a key opportunity and a key risk, be it reputational, be it stranded assets, a whole world of different risks there. And so working with that company, introducing them to others that you've come across, helping building coalitions. And I think the final point is also bringing the regulators on board. So one of the things I think Aviva is really good at is building coalitions of unusual bedfellows. So a group of NGOs and companies and investors all going to meet with the regulator on a particular topic. So it might be on sustainable fisheries, it might be on sustainable stock exchanges, all these different issues. And I find that regulators get really, they're really open to having these conversations when you're saying, I'm not just representing myself as an investor, I'm also representing a broad spectrum of NGOs and companies, and we all are singing from the same song sheet here. And that's when the magic seems to happen.
Interesting, yeah. We're getting some really great and questions from the audience, and I want to pick up from that and put this to you, Josefina. The question is, anyone who's visited the Philippines is aware that it is far from electricity for all. How are you planning to bring electricity to villages when there are no proper ends? And I think this still ends up connecting with how is that then also being financed. So if we can take a look at that.
Yes, that's true. Previous to 2010, the electrification statistics were based on the smallest political unit of our government, and that would be called the barangay. And we had at that time a count of 99.9%, but that just meant that an electricity line or a pole was actually there and reached that point. It did not count how many households. So now we've gone down to household electrification level with a target of 90%. It's actually a moving target. 90% electrification by 2017. We are now at the, if I'm not mistaken, 85% of the electrification target, but it's still quite a challenge, although roads might not be as much of a challenge as being an island, because then the islands would not have access to the bigger generation plants, and so they would be confined to what available resources would be in their particular islands. What the government has done has actually subsidized the putting up of lines. It's an enhancement program, putting up lines, poles, to reach the non-viable areas. Non-viable, I speak of non-viable from the perspective of the electric utilities that are privately owned. They are private cooperatives, and they have identified areas which cannot be reached because it's not economically viable for them, both, from the financial point of view and even technical considerations, because then would be more line losses the farther out you are. But the government has embarked on this enhanced electrification program and has given actually we have 119 electric cooperatives. So those are electric utilities spread out in franchise areas covering specific territories. So we have given different amounts depending on the assessment of how much they would need to achieve a particular electrification status. So that's how government is coming in. Secondly, we are also giving several incentives to private sector who will be developing power generation in those areas, especially the renewable energy resources. We have several potential wind, micro hydro resources, and of course solar development, being in the a very blessed country with the sun shining upon us. So that's how we're doing it. And there is, of course, that constant dialogue between the policymakers, the regulator, so the government side, and the private sector to be able to understand their needs. Because in government, you're pretty much also challenged by laws that have been in place for the longest time and certain frameworks that have put a certain mindset on certain development goals. So those paradigms need to be changed. You need a new policy direction. So that's where we're at.
Yes, Gina, I think this is something that we haven't spoken about when we're talking about energy and the low carbon context when we're developing economies. It's the capacity of communities to produce energy themselves. Right? Let's not forget that all the generation comes from fossil fuels, most of it. And the prices of fossil fuels have been very, very unstable. They're very low today, they've been very high. And when that happens, again, I'm not sure the government can keep subsidizing and providing energy to all. However, there are ways for the communities to generate energy themselves, through biofuels, to other means. They can even construct some of the devices themselves. I think that's Agus has done a few with his group. And I think we have to be really focused on that. The opportunity here is that we are already in a low carbon context, right? When we are integrating farmers, and rural families into the value chains, we need energy, right? But it is an opportunity to bring in clean energy, because if we're not bringing clean energy, we're going to bring another billion people, maybe 2 billion people, into a dirty energy scheme.
Can I just add that we actually learned this in India? The Philippines, there's an NGO in the Philippines that has been empowering women, not just women, but grandmothers. They make their own solar panels, and we learned that from you.
Of course. Your question really was about financing rural electrification. Now, my organization has now about 60 microgrids in the poorest parts of India, in the sort of eastern part of India, where there's virtually nothing in people's lives. And they need electricity for almost everything, like all of us. Now, the way we've done most of these is to find an anchor load. And usually it's an anchor load consisting of a cell phone tower, because cell phone towers are now everywhere. There are something of the order of 250,000 cell phone towers in rural India, which are off-grid. And they need electricity on a critical basis, 24/7. And they use diesel, which actually is quite expensive. Right now, it's not so bad, but it's been enormously expensive for them. They were hemorrhaging financially, and we came along and we offered them a half price from renewables. Now, that half price was still very profitable for us, and we cross-subsidized the other two sets of clients. The middle one being local enterprises, people who make ice or flour mills or whatever, small enterprises with 3, 5, 10 kilowatts needs. And then we doubly cross-subsidize the households. And as a result, we actually have a very, very close to 100% electrification on a commercially viable basis, because we're using the big sector's need for electricity as a way of generating enough profits to pay for virtually universal access.
I want to pick up from that just for a moment. Certainly your two countries' examples are interesting ways of where taking large systems and filling those gaps. But I know from within our own membership, Business Call to Actions membership, we have a number of companies, some working in India, nobody in the Philippines at this point, where business is coming up with those mechanisms that are being able to link where the government can't go, it's too costly, where the people themselves may not be able to just, they're either too poor, they're coming up with alternatives, but they're not the alternatives that are really fueling the entire community. So where does business and its ingenuity come in to be able to make these links so that people who are off-grid, people who are outside of the regular economy are being able to get this energy to where they're going, and then all the advantages that happen after that?
The implications of your question are always, when you talk business, you're talking big business. Business comes in, because all our 60 grids are, microgrids are business. But business comes in with small local entrepreneurs. Now, if big business wants to support them as franchises or local partners, that's very good, because big business has innovation capability and lots of capital. But if you're in a remote area, you can't send people who are used to having, wearing three-piece suits and ties and boots and everything else, going to the village. They're not going to do it. So you've got to find ways in which you mesh this thing. And ultimately, it always comes down to some local entrepreneur, a man or a woman, who essentially stands to make a business out of it. So it is business, but it's a different kind of business.
In the Philippines, we've seen partnerships. So a big company partners with a local company, because there's also the challenge of being able to integrate themselves into the community. So it's critical that you bring in locals to be able to get their cooperation, so to speak.
And some of the barriers, I guess, from the big business side of things, especially larger investors, is that they see sort of different pockets, that they don't have a special knowledge of these areas. So one of the ways to get over that is aggregate different projects together, which is where you can have intermediaries come in, aggregate it so that the risk appetite is more palatable for investors. One way of doing that is with a green bond, to wrap it around a particular project and to make sure that that bond adheres to the various standards that are out there. So there's transparency, there's accountability, and that way investors can get really comfortable with that and the capital can flow.
I want to also throw out one other question that's coming from the audience, and since our entire conversation really has been over these 2 days is about climate change, and we know that especially for the poor, a drought, flooding, whatever, makes an even greater impact than it does for more established individuals. What are some of the ways that the poor can business and all of this entire initiative help mitigate those impacts, so we don't have advances 2 steps forward and a step back the minute that something floods out the fields?
June, this is being one of the major problems that we're facing now. The patterns of rains are very irregular, so what we're getting are crop failures. And I think yesterday I was mentioning during the private session the drip irrigation systems. We are working with one of the largest, if not the largest, drip irrigation provider based in Israel. And we have created a university which we are spreading across the rural areas so that these farmers can have access to drip irrigation so they can control the water being one of the critical elements. But there are a lot of other things that can be done when you are talking about climate mitigation. We have been working with a Korean company to develop a biopreservative. A lot of people don't realize that, but when it's 2 degrees hotter or 5 degrees hotter, which is in some part of Africa and even Asia, your tomatoes are not going to reach the market. They will rot 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, 1 day earlier. So there are technologies that we are harvesting basically from different parts of the world in order to mitigate climate. I mean, we call it climate smart agriculture. We have other technologies that we use in order to keep water around the roots, right? So when it rains, the water is stored around the trees and all of it doesn't go down. So we have a certain number of what we call climate smart centers, where first of all governments, because it's taught there, that we call the decision makers, can come and see this technology, including my former colleagues from the UN, because they're too busy doing other things. So we take care of that, and we put all this technology into an area close to the city because they don't like to travel very far. And we can educate the decision maker on this is what we call this climate adaptation technology, in our case for agriculture, and as well as does the farmers, but in the rural centers.
You know, resilience is an issue that's not just for the poor villager in the third world. I mean, California is now going through a drought that, you know, is devastating, and people know that all over the world climate change is causing or beginning to cause major problems. In our case, we work a great deal with village communities to generate that kind of resilience. And it includes things all the way from village radios to local, you know, communication devices, all the way to new technologies. And what we've found is that people are willing to understand the long-term implications of getting into the global economy and cash crops and all the things that basically reduce resilience, may increase productivity and income for a year or two, but will in fact lead to a dead end within a decade. And crops, choice of crops, using natural fertilization, vermicomposting, organic this and that, have a huge set of you know, possibilities, and they're actually compatible with cultural practices in the first place. They forgot because, you know, modern agriculture has just come and been thrown at them by corporations that basically were just interested in the profits and have actually undermined the fertility as well as the resilience of the land in many places. So we do a lot of the kinds of things that William was saying, technical, drip irrigation, and so on. But ultimately, it's about the choice of whether you're going to be a local economy that's very happy and healthy, or are you going to be part of a global economy where people 3,000 miles away determine your future?
We are down to 1 minute. So if we can just have in 25 words or less from each one of you, what needs to happen within the next 5 years in order to be able to push forward the agendas that you each envision and that are needed from your individual perspectives in order to push forward this lower carbon economy and reach the prosperity that we've been trying to talk about here?
Sustainable Development Goals is a massive opportunity for all those things that you mentioned. And currently, they're being financed by overseas aid and development primarily, which is great. That's billions. But the key thing is if we can get the capital markets to tap into it, that's a pool of trillions. And that's when things really start to change.
I believe that there is a recognition that efficient and reliable access to energy is a key in being able to achieve these sustainable goals. But before we even get to that, there must be an acceptance and a commitment that it is a shared responsibility, not just something that you pass on to government or to private sector or leave the community to its own devices, but a shared responsibility, as I sent to you, a shared responsibility to light up homes and to light up lives.
I think prosperity is meaningless unless it's prosperity for all. And prosperity for all makes it a little bit complicated because at the bottom end, you really need to address solutions which are complex. And complex because they're technically complex and also financially and institutionally. They need a lot more innovation. And in order to do that, I mean, the single silver bullet, if you like, for a prosperous world is jobs, particularly jobs for women and the people who got left behind. But in order to do that, the silver bullet needs a certain manufacturing capability, which is dependent on energy, certainly, but in our work in the field, water is an even more constraining factor. So water, energy, I think Philippines doesn't have too much lack of water, so it's not a problem. But in many parts of the world, energy, water, and that basically enables the rest of the economy, the shelter, the infrastructure, all the other things to grow, and basically bringing, as I said, jobs for women right up front as the number one priority.
Well, I think we have to see it as a global opportunity because all these technologies that today are enabling climate mitigation especially for the $1 to $2 a day, are representing today a big opportunities. We are having technology from Korea, we have technology from the Philippines, from India. It is an opportunity to create jobs all around. Look at the economy in a different way. And when you are selling a $1 technology to 1 billion people or 2 billion people, it's big business. So we have to understand that there is a global common interest into going that road.
Well, thank you, Abigail, Josefina, Ashok, and William. And thanks to the audience. These were some wonderful questions. I know we didn't get them all answered, but you'll all be here for the rest of the day, so hopefully you'll be able to do that. Thank you very much.